Sir Isaac Brock, also known as the Saviour of Canada, was the Major General commanding the British troops in Upper Canada, now Ontario. Brock arrived in the Canadas in 1802 and spent the next 10 years preparing for the forthcoming American invasion. Brock's ability to lead in the battlefield and his ability to coordinate the Loyalists, the Indians, and his troops from home were greatly responsible for the successful defense of Upper Canada and the existence of present-day Canada. I grew up in Toronto and wrestled in high school. Toronto had two universities but no wrestling program in either. The University of Guelph and Brock University both had excellent wrestling programs and were both about an hour from home and about an hour away from each other. I chose to attend Guelph, but many of my friends attended Brock University, and we traveled to St. Catharines often to train with the Brock team. I remember driving past Brockville many times while traveling between Toronto and Montreal. I made more than one wrong turn because there was an exit off our main highway, the 401, for Brock Road, and very close by, Brock Street. I didn't take the time to learn about the man at the time, but there were many hints that he was kind of a big deal. After researching multiple candidates, I found the stories about him very inspirational, and he was someone that I wanted to learn more about. Young Isaac Brock was raised in a large family in Guernsey, the second largest island in the English Channel after Jersey. It's geographically close to the shores of Normandy. The Channel Islands are unique in that they are owned by the British monarch, but most of their inhabitants are French descendants from Normandy. Isaac's father, John Brock, was thought to be descendant of the knight Sir Hugh Brock. John had been a midshipman in the Royal Navy before his return to Guernsey, where he married Elizabeth de Lauzelle. Isaac, similar to Napoleon, was born in 1769. He had 6 older siblings. By 1775, he also had 3 younger siblings. In 1776, Isaac's father passed away. Fortunately, Elizabeth's family was of Guernsey's aristocracy. Isaac's first school was Queen Elizabeth College, but when he was 10, his family transferred him to a school in Southampton, England, where he garnered a reputation as an excellent boxer and swimmer. Young Brock was rumored to have often swam the half-mile along the sea-wall to Castle Cornet and back. In Brock's time, officer ranks in the military were purchased, and in 1775 the Brocks purchased a lieutenant's commission for Isaac's older brother John Jr. in the 8th Regiment of Foot, which was on duty at the Canadian border. In 1776, another of Isaac's older brothers, Ferdinand, was commissioned to ensign in the 60th Regiment. He sailed to North America as well. Ferdinand fell in the Battle of Baton Rouge, September 23, 1779. He was 19 years old. Isaac still wanted to follow in the footsteps of his older brothers when his time came. At 14, Isaac took a year to study French in Rotterdam, Holland, and at 15 he received his first commission as an officer. His brother John had been promoted to captain, leaving a vacancy in the 8th Regiment. The Brocks purchased an ensign's commission for Isaac for £400. Ensign Isaac Brock joined the 8th under Lieutenant Colonel Arent Schuler de Pester in 1785, and in 1790 he sold his ensign's commission for £400 and purchased a lieutenancy for £550. Brock quickly became a captain with his youngest brother Irving, now 16, serving under him as an ensign. In 1791, Irving resigned and became an apprentice to Isaac's older brother William, who was a partner in a bank. William was doing well and was able to finance the rest of Isaac's promotions. In June of 1791, Isaac transferred from the 8th to a captaincy of the 49th Regiment of Foot for £950. He was only 21. The 49th was stationed in Barbados. Some of his experiences there were preserved by his biographer and nephew, Ferdinand Brock Tupper. One experience that defined Brock's character was being challenged to a duel by a professional duelist and a crack shot. The courageous Brock accepted the challenge on one condition. Brock, being a large man and an easy target, insisted that instead of the usual 12 paces they fire across a handkerchief. in other words at point-blank range. His challenger backed down and was dishonored. This would not be the last time that Brock bluffed his opponent. Brock's time in the Caribbean was not easy. Many British men fell victim to yellow fever and malaria. Brock himself had to return home to Guernsey in 1793 due to illness. After his recovery, Brock befriended Reverend Alexander MacDonnell, a Roman Catholic priest and the chaplain of the 1st Glengarry Fencible Corps. In 1795, Brock purchased a Major's commission for £2,000, £500 more than the £1,500 he'd received for the sale of his captaincy. William once again covered the difference. Later, in 1795, Isaac's mother Elizabeth passed away. Isaac's sister, also named Elizabeth, moved into the family home with her husband and children. One of her sons, Ferdinand Brock Tupper, would later become the author of the most important work on Isaac's life. In October 1777, William, doing well in his banking business, backed Isaac for yet another promotion, this time to junior lieutenant colonel, costing £1,500 additional pounds. William also paid for extra servants, a good horse, and a headquarters. Brock was second in command of the 49th only to senior lieutenant colonel Frederick Keppel, who resigned in 1798, making Brock the senior lieutenant of the 49th. That year, his younger brother Savory joined him as a regimental paymaster. Isaac's second in command was Junior Lieutenant Colonel Roger Hale Schaff. The year is 1799, and although Brock now held a high rank, he had no actual battlefield experience. That would soon change when the 49th Foot, along with Russian allies, were sent to Holland to assist the Dutch to fight off the French in the Battle of Alkmaar. On October 2nd, Brock lost 33 men of the 49th in battle, and he himself was wounded by a spent ball that had lost momentum by the time it had hit him. Isaac wrote to his brother John, "I got knocked down shortly after the enemy began to retreat, but never quitted the field, and returned to my duty in less than half an hour." In 1801, the 49th were distributed on many ships during the Battle of Copenhagen against Denmark. Vice Admiral Horatio Nelson led the British to victory, but it was a bloody battle. The 49th had 13 killed and 41 wounded. During the battle, Nelson's superior, Admiral Sir Hyde Parker, hoisted a signal flag instructing all ships to retreat, but legend has it that Nelson held his telescope to his blind eye, exclaiming, "I see no flag." In June of 1802, the 49th departs for Quebec, arriving in August. The winter of 1802 to 1803 is spent in Montreal. Brock's older brother, John, dies in a duel at the age of 43. In the spring, Brock and the 49th set sail for York. In 1805, Brock goes to London to persuade the government for reinforcements. While there, he's promoted to full colonel on October 30th, 1805. Brock, upon hearing of American restlessness, cuts his leave short and sets sail back to the Canadas in June 1806, arriving in Quebec in late August. Upon his arrival, Brock is in charge of all the troops in the Canadas, because General Peter Hunter had recently passed away. In 1806, the modern-day province of Quebec was a British colony called Lower Canada, and modern-day Ontario was a British colony called Upper Canada. Collectively, they were called the Canadas. With full command of the troops, Brock wasted no time in preparing a defense for the Canadas. Brock's nephew, Ferdinand, discovered and published his correspondence. Brock wrote to Secretary of State Windham requesting the building of a military hospital in Quebec. Brock also wrote Windham about a list of 41 boats to be maintained. Brock had walls and gun batteries built. He began raising a militia and kept up good relations with the First Nation people, knowing that their warriors may be needed. Brock also held the position of Deputy Quartermaster General at the time, and he used that position to reform the provincial marine, which at the time was only used to transport people and supplies. Dockyards at Point Frederick, Kingston, and Amherstburg began the construction of a new fleet. In February 1812, Governor Prevost wrote to Brock informing him that the Prince Regent had approved his transfer to join Wellington against the French. Brock turned down the position that he had once longed for because he knew that Upper Canada needed his leadership. He asked Prevost's permission to remain in his present command. On February 27, 1812, Brock arranges for runners to bring a secret message to the person known among the tribes as the Red-Haired Man, a Scotch fur trader named Robert Dixon. Dixon knew Fort Mackinac well and was friends with the local Indians, the Sioux, Ojibwe, Ottawa, Menominee, and Winnebago. Brock later wrote a letter to Captain Charles Roberts ordering him to take Fort Mackinac when war was declared. Fort Mackinac was defended by a lone 9-pounder gun on the southeast side. Nearby was a hill leading to the high ground that was undefended. On the morning of July 17, 1812, Dixon and Roberts landed with their forces on the northeast side of the island. Some of Roberts' men hauled a 6-pounder to the top of the hill overlooking the fort. The combined threat of being bombarded from above by the 6-pounder and being slaughtered by the natives was enough to convince the American commander Porter Hanks to surrender. Roberts granted the American regulars the honors of war. They were allowed to leave for Detroit on parole, meaning they were sworn to never again take up arms against Great Britain. The American general William Hull had captured and occupied the nearby town of Sandwich in July. Hull, fearing a violent recapture, retreated back across the river to the safety of Detroit. The two armies now faced each other across the Detroit River. Brock gathered his force of 1,300 men, some regulars, some militia, and Indians led by the great Shawnee chief Tecumseh, and prepared his attack. When the Indian chief met Brock, he proclaimed, "This is a man," while the British commander called Tecumseh the Wellington of the Indians. The two exchanged sashes as a sign of mutual respect. The time had come to move on Detroit. Although greatly outnumbered 2-1, Brock would once again run a big bluff. The commander made their army look stronger than it actually was, knowing from Hull's intercepted letters that Hull and most of the Americans were terrified of the Indians. Brock had the Indians circle past the same clearing multiple times, making loud war cries to make it seem like their numbers were greater. The second strategy Brock employed was having his militia wear the outfit of his regulars, making it seem that he had a large force of crack regulars. Brock allowed Hull to intercept a fake letter suggesting that he had a force of 5,000 Indians on his side. On August 15, 1812, Brock had his two aides-de-camp, John Glenn and John Macdonell, deliver a letter to Hull. It read, "His Excellency Brigadier General Hull, commanding at Fort Detroit. The force at my disposal authorizes me to require of you the immediate surrender of Fort Detroit. It is far from my intention to join a war of extermination, but you must be aware that the numerous body of Indians who have attached themselves to my troops will be well beyond my control the moment the contest commences. I have the honor to be, sir, your most obedient servant, Major General Sir Isaac Brock." At first Hull refused the surrender, but the seeds were planted. Oak trees concealing a new gun battery were cut down, and during the night 600 natives crossed the Detroit River led by Tecumseh. The following morning Brock and his men crossed by boat, and the guns began firing. Brock led the charge, riding his horse Alfred. Colonel Robert Nichol said to Brock, "If we lose you, we lose all. Let me pray you allow the troops to pass on, led by their own officers." "Master Nichol," Brock replied, "I duly appreciate the advice you give me, but I feel that in addition to their sense of loyalty and duty, many here follow me from a feeling of personal regard, and I will never ask them to go where I do not lead them." Brock and his men rested a mile away from Hull's southern gate. The new gun battery was still firing on the fort. A cannonball cut the American Porter Hanks in half, and another blast killed two more. Seeing this and fearing what the Indians would do to his family who was with him was enough for Hull to send out the white flag of surrender. The paperwork gets signed, 1,600 American militia are sent home on parole, and 583 regulars are taken to Quebec as prisoners. The American brig the Adams is renamed the Detroit and added to the Provincial Marine. August 22nd, 1812. Brock arrives in Niagara ready to make a preemptive strike against the American Van Rensselaer in Lewiston. To his dismay, Governor Prevost had arranged a temporary truce with the Americans. Brock detested this as he knew that the Americans were buying time to properly prepare their next attack. Brock had lost the attacker's advantage of concentrating his forces and had to spread his defenses thinly across multiple attack routes. Van Rensselaer commanded an army of about 6,000, regulars, volunteers, and militia. His plan was to cross the Niagara River and take Queenston Heights, while Brigadier General Alexander Smith led his force of 1,700 regulars across the river into Fort Niagara to attack from the rear. But Smith ignored his orders and left Van Rensselaer to attack Lewiston alone. Brock had been staying at Fort George on the morning of October 13th. He was awakened at 3 in the morning by the sound of distant gunfire. The noise was coming from Queenston, 5 miles to the south. He ordered General Sheaffe to gather a large force and meet him in Queenston. He mounted his trusty steed Alfred, and with Glegg, MacDonell, some reinforcements, and some Iroquois warriors, he headed south. Brock galloped past the York Volunteers at Brown's Point. They were marching for Queenston. This is most likely where he uttered the legendary words, "Press on, brave York Volunteers." Niagara's main defense was an 18-pounder mounted on a redan partway up the Niagara escarpment. Brock galloped into Queenston, up the hill to the redan, where he could see the American force, and knew now that he was facing Van Rensselaer's main attacking force. He sent orders for troops from Fort Erie and Chippewa to join him. The American captain, John E. Wool, had managed to lead about 50 men along a steep trail to the heights above the redan. Brock ordered the 18-pounder spiked. This meant jamming it so it couldn't be used, and led the artillerymen down the hill. Brock rounded up 100 of the 49th. He was determined to retake the redan immediately rather than wait for any reinforcements. He did not want the enemy to consolidate on the high ground. Brock tethered Alfred behind a stone wall and led his men up the hill into battle. They were taking heavy fire, and noticing some of his men falling back, he shouted, "This is the first time I have ever seen the 49th turn their backs." And he charged up the hill at the front of the pack, over 6 feet tall and bright red. He took one bullet to the wrist and kept charging up the hill until he was finally stopped in his tracks by a bullet through the heart. 15-year-old George Jarvis, a volunteer with the 49th, recounted years later, "Our general fell on his left side within a few feet of where I stood. I inquired, 'Are you much hurt, sir?' He placed his hand on his left breast and did not reply." MacDonell was shot shortly afterwards and died the following day. The British fell back a mile away carrying the bodies of their 2 leaders. The next day, British reinforcements, 300 Mohawk Indians, and General Sheaffe arrived. Sheaffe planned out a flanking route to the heights, avoiding the American artillery, and the Americans were eventually overwhelmed and forced to surrender. Van Rensselaer later reported that the victory was in the hands of the Americans, but to his astonishment, he couldn't convince the American troops to cross the river and reinforce the first wave that had already landed. The War of 1812 ended in a stalemate in 1814. The brave Shawnee chief Tecumseh would also lose his life in the war. On October 16, 1812, a funeral was held for Brock and MacDonell at Fort George. Thousands attended, including regulars, militia, and native warriors. The British fired a 21-gun salute to honor their fallen commanders. The Americans across the river even fired their guns in respect. There was a 3-day truce in place at the time. A monument was erected in 1824, and the bodies of Major General Sir Isaac Brock and the Lieutenant Colonel John MacDonell were removed from the York Bastion at Fort George and reburied at the monument with a ceremony. Canadian teacher and writer James L. Hughes wrote a poem about Brock. I'll finish with the first stanza. Upon the heights at Queenston, one dark October day, invading foes were marshalled in battle's dread array. Brave Brock looked up the rugged steep and planned a bold attack. No foreign flag shall float, he said, above the Union Jack.